Today we're delving into the Guard Forge World range with a review of the Macharius tank series. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Now the Macharius tank line is a super heavy variant of the Imperial Guard tank series, perhaps a little bit more reminiscent of a leman russ than a baneblade. They've been available from Forge World for quite a while now, and as they're Forge World, of course they'll set you back quite a bit money wise. Each one costs £126. In this video we'll be going over the 4 variants of Macharius tanks: the heavy tank, the Omega, the Vulcan and the Vanquisher, seeing what those main guns can do, any obvious buffs and synergies if you want to run one as part of your guard army, and how I would use them on the tabletop. In the background, the Macharius tank is a variant super heavy vehicle, slightly smaller than a baneblade, but bigger than a leman russ by a considerable margin. It's typically produced by Forge Worlds that lack the baneblade's standard template construct, which isn't very widely available. They saw some extensive use during the Great Crusade and were largely neglected for a long time, being resurrected by the Forge World Lucius, and the new tank being named after Lord Solar Macharius. While the tank lacks the sheer size and multitude of weapon options of the baneblades, it can still somewhat fulfill the same battlefield role, and a typical tank is armed with twin-linked battle cannons, a hull-mounted twin-linked heavy stubber, and sponson-mounted heavy bolters. There are even less common variants of the Macharius, such as the Vanquisher, and the Vulcan that sports the enormous Vulcan mega bolter. This 175-ton tank is often employed by the Death Corps of Krieg, though it also sees wider use across the astra militarum. So if we take a look at the datasheets for the Macharius heavy tank, we can see it's a super heavy Titanic Lord of War choice for astra militarum, with a profile that's pretty reminiscent of the baneblades, to be honest. At base it will cost you 368 points, when equipped with a Macharius battle cannon, twin heavy stubbers and 2 heavy bolters. It has a reasonably impressive profile, again very similar to the baneblade. It has a movement of 10, weapon skill 5+, ballistic skill 4+, strength and toughness of 8, 22 wounds, leadership 8 and a 3+ save. We well know what heavy stubbers and heavy bolters do, but that Macharius battle cannon is extra vicious. It's a 72-inch range weapon with heavy 2d6, strength 8, AP -2 and a flat damage d6, so very much like firing 2d6 crack missiles at your opponent. The model has a few options, including replacing those heavy bolters on the sponsons with either heavy stubbers or heavy flamers. The heavy stubbers are very cheap indeed, only 2 points per, and the heavy flamers are a little bit more expensive at 14 points each. Personally, I'm the biggest fan of the heavy bolters on this one. I would typically pay the extra few points to give it some extra decent range damage, although the heavy stubbers are still a great option if you don't want to. The heavy flamers for me, they're not bad, but it does mean that you'd have to put your tank right up front. In some games that'll be fine, but in plenty of games you really won't want to. It can take a hunter killer missile, which is 6 points, and that's a bit of a take or leave option for me. I'd be happy to have it, but no big deal if you don't. And it can also take a storm bolter or heavy stubber as a pintle mounted weapon, which you should definitely do. I'd say the heavy stubber is better due to its steel behemoth special rule. This one's the fairly standard super heavy one, where it can fall back in the movement phase and still shoot and charge, and it can also move without penalty to firing heavy weapons. In addition, it can still fire its heavy weapons when enemy units are within 1 inch of it, though they have to target units that are greater than 1 inch away. Basically this thing is going to be reliably firing until your opponent actually manages to destroy it. Unlike leman russ battle tanks, they can't just lock it up. On top of this, it also has smoke launchers. If for some reason you should be out of targets, then you can get it -1 to hit next turn, and it has an absolutely enormous explosion, which if you roll the dreaded 6 on the explosion roll, then it will shower d6 mortal wounds to everyone within 2d6 of it. You really don't want this thing going off in the middle of your army, and it might be best to save a command reroll to make sure it doesn't. I think overall the main gun is really what you take this for. That nasty battle cannon will put out an average of 5 or 6 wounds on a standard vehicle target from a very long way away. So let's take a look at the other variants then. Next up we have the Macharius Omega. This one's armed with an Omega plasma blast gun. It's got a few slight profile differences to the original tank. It loses the hull-mounted twin heavy stubber, and it can have no sponsons at all if you choose, and if it does take sponsons, the choices are between autocannons, heavy bolters or heavy flamers. This one will cost you 355 points base, so say if you added autocannon sponsons to that, then that's 375 points for the tank. The plasma blast gun can either fire pulsed or maximal bolts. It's a 60-inch range heavy 2d6 weapon. The pulsed bolts are strength 8, AP -3 and damage 2, where the maximal bolts are heavy 2d6, strength 9, AP -3 and flat damage 3, but you suffer mortal wounds on the roll of a 1, as is normal with overcharged plasma. The pulse bolts are exactly what you want for chewing through things like Primaris Marines, wounding them on 2s with good AP and dealing flat 2 damage, and the maximal bolts are really quite good as an anti-armour option. Compared with the standard Macharius, it does very slightly better against standard toughness 7 vehicles, dealing about 6 wounds on average, and that's also just as good against toughness 8, which the regular Macharius will suffer a bit against. You do lose out on those heavy stubbers though by taking this one, and you do have the chance to put some mortal wounds on yourself, so overall I'd say the two variants are fairly well balanced. Next we have the Macharius Vanquisher. This one has the same options as the standard Macharius heavy tank, but comes in a little bit pricier, with 383 points if you're giving it twin heavy stubbers and 2 heavy bolters. The Vanquisher cannon has 2 different profiles, which is really quite helpful. It can fire out blast shells, which are 72 inch, heavy 2d6, strength 8, AP-2, damage d3. So pretty much the same as your standard Leman Russ battle tank, firing its regular battle cannon with grinding advance. Or it can choose to fire the armor piercing shells, which are 72 inch, heavy 2, strength 9, AP-3, damage d6, and you roll 2 dice when inflicting the damage and discard the lowest result. Needless to say, like all Vanquisher cannons it seems, the armor piercing shells are complete junk, only doing an average of 2.5 wounds to a vehicle that it fires at, so worse than the standard tank and worse than the Omega, and hilariously enough worse than the blast shells against a standard toughness 7 vehicle. I'm afraid as it stands this one is just directly outcompeted by the standard version, particularly as it's more expensive. I honestly don't think that there's anything that this one does better than the standard Macharius heavy tank. If you've got one of these, probably just run it as the standard heavy tank. I'm sure most people won't know the difference. Finally, we come to the Macharius Vulcan and its Vulcan heavy bolter. Again, this one's got the same profile and weapon options as the main heavy tank, and it costs just 5 points more than that, so one with 2 heavy bolters and a twin heavy stubber will set you back 373 points. Its Vulcan Mega Bolter has a 60 inch range, it's heavy 15, strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2, but if it doesn't move during its movement phase, then you can double the amount of shots that it gets, getting a heavy 30 shot until the end of the turn. Needless to say, you really don't want to be moving this thing. Those heavy 30 shots will really chew through heavily armoured infantry, again such as Primaris Marines. This will on average put down about 7 intercessors per turn, which is none too bad. Also pretty funnily, if it does manage to fire its Vulcan Mega Bolter twice, then it actually does more damage to tanks than the Omega or the standard heavy tank. It'll do between 6 and 7 wounds to those tanks. Obviously you do have to give up movement to do it, but it really does propel it to the next level, making it very flexible and decent in both engaging enemy armour and enemy infantry. So overall, the Macharius tank series is very similar to the baneblades, lack a few of the nice bits of gear and some of the stat line of the baneblades, and don't get quite as many guns on the sponsons, and they're mainly just focused on providing that one enormous gun. So let's talk about how we can get a bit more out of them on the tabletop then. First of all, we have regiment choice, which you can get for a super heavy detachment if you have either 3 of them, or if you're including them in a Supreme Command detachment, which is usually going to be the easiest way to unlock them. You could run one alongside maybe 3 tank commanders as a dedicated tank force, for example. Cadian reroll 1s to hit in the shooting phase if they don't move is usually reasonable, particularly so on the Macharius Vulcan that's going to be wanting to stay still anyway. Katachan for rerolling the number of shots with the turret weapon is great on any of the variants that have that number of shots, and the same rerolls can be achieved by custom regiments, which you could also pair with a little bit of extra range, or the very excellent jury-rigged repairs to have them regenerate wounds over the course of the game. You could potentially outflank them with Talon, but the regimental trait doesn't actually really do much for them, seeing as the steel behemoth rule is already baked in, and Valhallan can sometimes be interesting on these big models just because it means they won't be bracketed quite as easily. They're a lot more likely than your standard Leman Russ tank to be damaged but not destroyed. In terms of synergy with characters, any big Lords of War are usually good synergy with any characters that can get to them. Astropaths are one of the top choices, as you can potentially have these guys saving on a 2+ and -1 to hit for the very cheap investment of 30 points. Tech Priests can also repair them. You could get reroll 1s from things like Yarick or Harker, and potentially some reroll wound rolls from Old Grudges if you have that Warlord nearby. You have the option to be able to use the super heavy tank ace ability, as it applies to any Titanic astra militarum unit, and you can get things like Steadfast Leviathan, which means that it'll get a regimental doctrine even if it's in a super heavy auxiliary detachment, or hold down deployment, which can give it the benefit of cover until the first time it moves in the battle. That one in particular would usually be worth a command point, particularly on a Macharius Vulcan, which hopefully isn't going to be moving in the game anyway, and it can just be sat there as a battlefield bunker, safe behind its 2+ save all game long. In terms of stratagems, all the usual guard vehicle ones apply. If you've only just been bracketed, then jury rigging is basically an auto include for just pushing it up to the next bracket so it can hit a little bit better in the shooting phase. Defensive gunners for 5+ Overwatch is great. Crush them could help you flatten an annoying troop or two in close combat, and Vengeance for Cadia is of course excellent on a big unit when you're fighting the forces of chaos. Very sadly, they can't make use of the relentless stratagem from the greater good, as it explicitly excludes Titanic vehicles. So how would I field these guys in game then? First of all, I would generally want to be including sponsons on them, whether it's heavy stubbers, heavy bolters, or autocannons, all are good. Though I'd be inclined to use the heavy bolters on them, just for some reliable all-round firepower with decent range. I'd always take a heavy stubber or storm bolter, and out of the choice of main cannons, my favourite at the moment is the Macharius Vulcan. Just being able to access that mad strong double fire ability is really good. After that, my next favourite is the Omega, then the heavy tank, although I think that those two are very close and do have different roles that can equally work. Unfortunately, as we said before, the Vanquisher just really doesn't make the cut. In game, these guys have the luxury of not being quite as upset if something manages to touch them in close combat, so you do have the potential of using them as a little bit more outlying threatening unit, rather than one that must absolutely be screened at all times, such as regular leman russes. If you aren't using any other heavy tanks that are quite so big and scary, then they're great for the astra to buff. I'd go far as saying that they're pretty mandatory in most guard lists with big armour these days. If you are running the Vulcan variant, then where you deploy it in the first turn is going to be absolutely critical. I'd really think about somewhere where it can be relevant all game long, but hopefully isn't just going to get destroyed quickly by the enemy. I'd be a little bit bolder with him than I would otherwise, probably starting somewhere fairly close to the front line, and somewhere where he has the best line of sight possible. He will have very decent damage output if he doesn't have to move, so every turn that you can keep him not moving is a turn where you're going to be dealing far more damage. The others can actually be quite a lot more flexible. You can actually deliberately deploy them somewhere where they're going to be expecting to use their 10-inch movement to get in range, so they could potentially outrange other enemy threats, or perhaps even potentially hide out of line of sight and move into line of sight, as you don't suffer any penalty for moving and shooting with those heavy weapons. From there, they're going to be very much just point and delete tanks, trundling around and blowing up the threats that are most worrying to you. Though bear in mind that if you are fighting an opponent where it doesn't really matter how close you are to them, then you can use them very aggressively indeed, as they could roll right up to them, engage things in close combat, tie them up and be a nuisance, and still maintain their exact same amount of firepower due to that steel behemoth special rule. If you did manage to get some sort of dream of being able to pin an enemy unit in close combat, maybe you charge the Macharius tank in, and then you wrap the enemy unit with an infantry squad or conscript blob for example, you could potentially create yourself the very silly situation in which the enemy can't fall back from your tank, but the tank can keep on firing even when it's in close combat, meaning that the opponent won't be able to deal with it at range. I don't suspect that this will happen very often, but I look out for crafty opportunities to be able to do it. Late game, you can use its reasonable movement to go out and claim some objectives and be a nuisance, as we said, though if you have got to the point where you're advancing with super heavies at the end of the game, then it's probably going very well already. So the big question is how this thing compares to standard leman russes and the baneblade series then, and frankly that does seem to be the sticking point of the Macharius. In terms of its defensive profile, it's not as strong as the leman russ. Standard russes will put you a lot more toughness 8 wounds on the table for less points, and unless you load up tank commanders with the most expensive upgrades, then in general it'll still be even more expensive than tank commanders too. This really isn't good, as tank commanders frankly have a better damage output than this thing by a long way, so if you've got a worse damage output and a similar defense, then it becomes pretty obvious that the tank commanders are going to be in general a better choice competitively. The main advantages of this thing are pretty similar to the baneblade really, the fact that it can't be locked up in close combat and stopped shooting, and the fact that it's really quite a big unit where everything's concentrated in one mass, which means that you can focus your buffs on it on just one unit, give it the extra defense from astropaths, maybe a Vostroyan stratagem for +1 to hit or something, so it can be a way to help it compete via synergy. So what happens if we compare them to baneblades then? For me, out of the baneblade series, a pretty close equivalent to the Macharius heavy tank is the Doomhammer. This one also costs 350 points, plus a twin heavy bolter, meaning that it's 366 points. It does have significant advantages in strength 9, those crushing adamantium tracks that make it do decent melee damage, 26 wounds, far more attacks, and on top of that its main weapon, the magma cannon, is just stronger as well. It's heavy 2d6, strength 10, AP -5 damage d6, so it's basically superior in every way bar range. In terms of the top end competitive game, I'm afraid the existence of the Doomhammer does really make the Macharius heavy tank and Omega somewhat obsolete, I'm afraid. It's just better damage output, better defense, and also has a transport capacity to boot. I do think that the biggest niche of the Macharius series is the Vulcan, which actually does compare reasonably favourably to its baneblade equivalent, the Stormlord. The Stormlord's Vulcan Megabolter only gets heavy 20, and it gets that all the time regardless of moving. So the Macharius Vulcan actually does outshoot this thing. The Stormlord also costs more, but does come with those other advantages such as adamantium tracks, more wounds, and a very big transport capacity. So overall competitively, I'd say that most of the Macharius line is somewhat eclipsed. The best chance that they have is the Vulcan, which does have very decent shooting provided it stays still, and I think does offer something different to the Guard army. Sure, tank commanders might well outshoot it, but they do have their own disadvantages, such as potentially being locked up, so I think you could honestly do worse than a well-supported Vulcan tank with a few astropaths sat at the front of your deployment zone, shredding an enemy unit per turn. It most certainly gives your opponent a threat that they really need to deal with, because those Vulcan Megabolters will put a nasty dent in most things. So let me know if you've had any experience fielding the Macharius tanks in 40k at the moment. I do think that they need a little bit of a balance redress, as the other variants have just caught up with them a bit between the Guard Codex and the chapter approved points cost reductions. At the moment I just don't really feel there's a massive niche for most of the variants, particularly not the poor Vanquisher, which is completely fully eclipsed within its own line. I'll certainly look forward to seeing if they do anything with the Forge World update books for these tanks. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we do have regular Guard content coming out every few days. And if you'd like to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, where the link is in the description below. Making these videos does take me quite a while, so if you've been enjoying regularly, then any support is absolutely greatly appreciated, as the supporters on Patreon are what allow me to focus this much time on making videos at the expense of my regular real world job. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you guys next time.